recorded so that we will post it up to the Mason Library website when we're finished. It might take a little while because we're running a little behind with that aspect of things, but it will be up there shortly. So Dennis Picard, who is our presenter for this evening, he's been a museum professional in the living history field for over 40 years. He's worked at Old Sturbridge Village in Sturbridge, Massachusetts, and he was there for 12 years. He eventually advanced to lead interpreter, and he researched and designed many public programs that are still offered there today. He's also served on the staff of Hancock Shaker Village as a historic trade craftsman and a site interpreter. And he has received various grants that allow him to serve as a project coordinator and research and implement programs and events at historic sites around the region. He's served as a consultant for many historical societies and museums. He's edited film scripts and reviewed historic novels for accuracy. He's an all-around fabulous guy and really, really good historian.
Well, I call this number and then I have an access number.
Okay. And I'm just letting you know that on February 25th, he'll be back doing another program on the history of maple sugaring in New England. How's the screen sharing going, Dennis?
I don't know. I'm getting, when I do share screen, I'm getting, should I do a basic? I don't remember all this last time. Oh, there we go.
I've given you control of it, so it should be
Okay.
right. Okay, there we go.
All right, we need to go back one here. All right. Can everybody see that first screen, Crystal Products of the Frost King?
Yes. Yep.
We're good. Okay. So we be ready?
Yep. We be
All
ready.
right. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, we're going to be talking tonight about the early ice trade in the United States, probably more specifically in New England, and focused a bit on Massachusetts. This quote or this title actually comes from a quote from up in Hancock, Crystal Products of the Frost King. It came from a journal kept by a Shaker Eldris, and she was talking about what had gone on during the previous month. And she said that the men had gone up to the reservoir to reap the crystal products of the Frost King. And I just thought that was a great way to title this. And the picture here is actually some blocks of ice from down in Windsor, Connecticut, on a lake that we had harvested there. Before we got going, we were just chatting a little bit about ice and ice quality. And if you look at the ground level, for lack of a better term, that these blocks are sitting on, and you see how black it is, that's actually what you want to look for as an ice harvester or an ice dealer. You want to look for a pond that appears to be like an asphalt parking lot, to put it in modern terms, absolutely black. That is the purest, most compact, best ice that you can get. But we'll get into that a little more later. The whole story started with this guy right here. This was painted obviously when he's a white-haired, successful gentleman. But when he was a younger lad in his 20s, he and his brothers were sitting around the family table, the Tudor family table, trying to figure out how the heck they were going to get their father out of debt and get the farm out of debt so that they would have something to inherit when his time came and it was time for them to take over the property. And the farm was not very successful. It was not very fertile. So, as I said, they were kind of putting their heads together. And this is the way Frederick Tudor, the gentleman in the portrait here, recalled it years later in his book called the Ice House Journal, is what he called his memoirs. And he said that one of the brothers suggested perhaps they sell rocks, since the farm was so full of rocks every year when they planted it. And everybody laughed at that and said, you know, there's There's no way that you're going to sell rocks because there's rocks all over the place. That's just not going to do it. So Frederick Tudor said, let's sell people cold. And his brother said, what do you mean cold? And he says, well, we have cold here in New England. We have cold in Massachusetts, but there are lots of places on Earth that never experiences cold. And I want to sell them cold because we do have it here. And his brother said, how are you going to sell people cold? And he said, I'm going to sell people ice. And they had a couple of ponds on the farm. And that winter in 1806, the winter of 1805, 1806, Frederick Tudor hired a bunch of his neighbors to come out with axes and two-man saws and to chop out some rumble jumble, all different shapes and sizes of pieces of ice, load them onto an ox cart or many ox carts and wagons and bring them to the port of Boston. And he was pretty sure that he was going to be able to find a ship that would be able to take this cargo and bring it to where he wanted it to go. But as he went from shipmaster to shipmaster and shipping company to shipping company, they all looked at him and said, Frederick, water goes outside of our boats. We don't put water in our boats. So he was stuck with all this ice sitting on the wharves in Boston with no place to go. Nobody would take it on him. So he went back home and he actually borrowed from his neighbors. Now, this guy, considering he had dropped out of Harvard, he wasn't an uneducated person, but he had dropped out because he was sick of looking at a future of being a shop clerk, which is kind of what his father wanted him to do. Anyway, he must have been pretty persuasive because he talked his neighbors into lending him $2,000. So or actually a little more than that in 1806, which is a huge amount of money at that time. But he got the money on speculation, and he brought it down to the port, and he bought himself an old worn out brig by the name of the Favorite. And he loaded all of his ice on the Favorite, and he bought it down to the French-controlled island of Martinique. And Martinique in the Caribbean had never experienced cold. So he was offering, just as he told his brothers, he was offering these people a product that they were unfamiliar with. And it just so happened there was an outbreak of yellow fever at the same time. And if you have a fever, what do you want to do? You want to bring that fever down, and you do it by using ice. So even though he lost over 25% of his cargo through melting, he was able to prove that you could ship ice and you could find markets for it in areas that hadn't experienced it. And he went on for the next 30 years to develop his ideas and refine his ideas. And we'll talk a little more about him, his ideas tonight. But by 1839, he was worth $1 million, not $1 million as what the money back then would be worth today. He had 1839 $1 million. Yeah, some people balk at the fact that he's often called the first millionaire. Well, if he wasn't the first, he was one of the first millionaires in the United States by selling people cold, even though everybody laughed at him for doing that. Well, not only did he develop a business, and this is a very, very unusual business because most businesses start at something that you do locally. You find success by doing it locally, and you expand it to a few other franchises. And then from there, you go further and further from your hometown. According to Frederick Tudor's model, let me just take a sip here. Since you're selling it to people that have cold, he had no interest at all in selling ice in New England where he was located or in Massachusetts where he was located. He was interested specifically at selling ice to a much broader market. So throughout the early years of the ice industry, all of the ice that was harvested by Frederick Tudor and eventually his competitors went in other areas. And he shipped ice to the Caribbean. He shipped ice to the southern United States. he shipped ice to places that you never would imagine. He shipped it to Japan, he shipped it to Australia, and his biggest profits came by shipping ice to India. He actually, after the Favorite did its service, he made enough money that he had his own ice ships, his own design of ships with cork insulation and multiple hulls to isolate the ice from the warmth of the seawater. He was able to ship ice to India, lost much less than the 25% he had in the Favorite. And he was able to sell it to the market there. Now, it wasn't people locally that, or indigenous people locally in India. Who he was selling it to was the English that were unofficially running the place at that time. And the English, coming from the climate that they came from, were only too happy to buy the ice to cool their drinks in India. He made such a splash, if you will, in the market in India and made such profits. Frederick Tudor, being Frederick Tudor, decided that he could do even better. And one year he took a crop of Baldwin apples, a native of Massachusetts. Baldwin apples were discovered in the eastern part of Massachusetts. And he loaded a cargo of Baldwin apples inside of a vault that he created by stacking the ice like an igloo. And when he got to India, the English there were only too happy to buy the apples. And he made more money on selling the apples than he did the ice. And if that wasn't good enough, he thought about it and he held off his shipment, because it took many months to get to India, but he held off his shipment long enough for the strawberry crop to come in. And when the strawberry crop came in, he loaded that on his ice ships and brought that to India. And he's able to sell it there, you know, strawberries and cream, big English thing. So again, that's how a guy like Frederick Tudor from an indebted farm ends up making himself a millionaire. He did have a little bit of a hiccup in India, especially in Calcutta, because when they arrived, he usually stored his ice in a wooden ice house, which is another part of the story. But it wasn't allowed because of fires on the wharves in India. He had to build his new ice house out of stone. So the Tudor ice house was built out of limestone. It looks like a temple, and it is still there today. It's a restaurant today. It's not an ice house any longer. And it's actually a little bit dank because it doesn't have any ventilation, or very much ventilation. It doesn't have the windows, as you might expect, an ice house. So anyway, that's a bit about Frederick Tudor, and we can touch on him a little more later on. But let's talk about the actual cutting of ice. And this is a quote from Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau, when he was living on Walden Pond, just happened to be there during some ice harvesting seasons. And he talks a little bit about it. And he said, "There came 100 men of Hyperborean extraction, swooped down on our pond one morning with many carloads of ungainly looking farming tools, sleds, plows, drills, barrows, turf knives, spades, saws, and rakes." And if you see in the picture, on the left is a stack of my tools waiting to cut some ice up in Granville, Massachusetts. And there are plows, and there are spades, and there are bars, breaker bars, there's forks, there's shovels, there's all kinds of specialized tools. And on the right, you can see examples of some of the basic tools that an ice crew would have. Now, something interesting about the tools is that they all started as tools for cutting wood. So as I said early on, when Frederick Tudor first invited his neighbors, they brought axes and they brought two-man saws and so forth. And those tools were modified to answer the need of this new business. There hadn't ever been anything like this. So there weren't any specialized tools, but there definitely became specialized tools. And you find people like William Wood here in Arlington, Massachusetts. He started in up in the Byfield, Massachusetts area, and he was making manure forks. And he decided that the future in tool making was going to be in this new upstart business of the ice industry. And William Wood began making just ice tools and not all the other blacksmithing work he did in 1834, as it says here in his advertisement. And he made ice tools, and his sons made ice tools, and his grandsons made ice tools for about 100 years. And William Wood, in business for himself or in partnership with other people, was one of the oldest and definitely one of the largest ice tool makers in the United States. Most of the tools that were made were ones that were designed by one of Frederick Tudor's, what we should say, competitors. He was a competitor by the name of Nathaniel Wyeth, who, as they said at the time, was a natural engineer. He looked at things and he came up with ways to solve engineering problems. And one thing that he put his mind to was the ice tool industry. And the first patent that he had was for an ice plow. And this is a picture of an ice plow in the advertisement for William Wood. And the ice plow really revolutionized the ice industry, because you think about it for a minute, those random shaped blocks, cubes, whatever you want to call them, that Tudor originally did, when they piled them together, they ended up with a lot of dead airspace around each one of the blocks. And all that airspace were created areas for warm air and eventually warm water to get into, and caused a very rapid and premature melting and failure of the ice crop. So Nathaniel Wyeth, by developing a plow that you could grid off, you could make a pattern on your ice pond so that all the blocks were exactly the same size, and you could therefore stack all your blocks for storage, like stacking bricks or cinder blocks, very tightly together, literally, so they refreeze. That's something that most people don't get. You know, oh, I want to take the block out. You know, I don't want to refreeze. You want them to refreeze, so they create a huge thermal mass. And that huge thermal mass is what will allow you to have ice that you can ship to India and not have everything melt away on you. Well, there are other companies that got into the business. Here you see, the Prey Company up in New York. You've got Gifford Wood, which is one of the partnerships that William Wood entered into. He made the Ice King plow, which is probably one of the most common plows that you see out there. And up on the left-hand side, you see the Ames Plow Company. And if you've ever been to Faneuil Hall in Boston to go to the markets, you've been in one of the spaces that was run by the Ames Company. They had a huge showroom in Faneuil Hall. That was like going to a car dealership today. They would walk you down aisle upon aisle of gleaming, bright, brand new ice plows and breaker bars and pikes and Boston pattern and Rhode Island pattern axes. And you could pick out whatever you wanted there. You might pick yourself out a plow, and for an extra $1, you could get a cover for it. So, it's like buying undercoating in a car, in the old days or whatever. But they would sell you whatever kind of tools you want. And I will say that when I harvest ice today, and I've been harvesting ice since 1995, the winter of 95, 96 was the first time that I did a relatively large scale ice harvest for a museum. And today I still do ice harvesting for museums and environmental education centers to teach about history and to teach about thermodynamics. But anyway, I use Ames plows and I use Ames saws. I do like the metal and so forth that they're made out of. Ames Company is actually still around today. It's the Ames Shovel Company. And people are probably not familiar with them because of their involvement in the 19th century and early 20th century with the ice trade. They may be familiar with them because they buy their garden tools with that name, the Ames, on them today. But most people, if they know the Ames name through history, they know about the Transcontinental Railroad and how the Ames Company had the contract, the one contract to supply all of the shovels to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, a little money exchanged hands, while that kind of deal was being made, and they were investigated through Congress, and it was it's kind of a black eye with the company. But anyway, Ames certainly made ice tools, and they made a good quality of product. You could even go, if you're a local farmer or somebody living out in the boonies, by the end of the 19th century, you could get a Montgomery Ward or Sears catalog, and you didn't have to go to a showroom. You could buy your tools and get them through the mail, get them through freight. So, to speak literally, 100 Irishmen with Yankee overseers came from Cambridge every day to get out the ice. They divided it into cakes by methods too well known to require description. And then he goes on for 16 more pages to actually describe it, even though he says he didn't have to do it. And certainly by the 1840s, when he was writing this, people were familiar enough with the trade. And by the end of the 19th century, another half century after Thoreau wrote this, the ice trade was the 9th largest industry in the United States and employed literally hundreds of thousands of people and produced millions upon millions of tons, not pounds, tons of ice a year. And you can see, again, some blocks of ice from this. These are from Granville, Massachusetts, from a pond there. And I want to call your attention to the, the lower right hand, because that's just the beginning of a stack of ice, because a lot of people are concerned about how long does ice last. Well, Henry David Thoreau talks about the ice that was cut on Walden Pond. He doesn't mention it, but it was being cut specifically for use by the Fitchburg Railroad. And the workers there stacked the ice along the railroad tracks, which is now a commuter rail, by the way. You can actually visit, and I've done lectures and cut ice at Walden Pond. Anyway, they stacked the ice along the railroad tracks. They're waiting for it to be picked up. And it was such a good year for ice, the railroad never came and got it. They left it there. And Thoreau talks about how it lasted all that winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall, and didn't melt till 3 springs after that, with no ice house. It was such a huge, it was a 40-foot high pile of ice. It was called the ice fort. And the outside was originally covered with straw. The straw all washed away the first summer, and then it sat there. And he said when the sun rose, it would seem green as the sunlight refracted through it. But it's amazing, by creating that thermal mass, how long the ice will last. How long does ice last in an ice house? The records that I've seen show between 5 and 7 years your ice will last, because you always want to put in a little extra ice in your ice house in case you have a bad year. Luckily, when Tudor and the other ice people got involved with the trade, we just happened to be at the end of, they didn't know it was the end of, but we happened to be at the end of the Little Ice Age. So the winters were much colder than what they were a century or even a half century later. I've noted in journals that at the beginning of the 19th century, most places were getting in their ice crop by the end of January, right around this time, from this time to the end of the month. By the latter part of the 19th century, they're getting their crops in by the middle and end of February. So the winters bounced back and became more normal, whatever that is, for this part of the planet. And it warmed up, and it eventually did change the whole trade. So how do you do this stuff? Well, after clearing the snow, if you've got some on the pond, and that's something else you have to be careful of. When you clear the snow off your pond, you dump it hopefully on the shore. If you dump it on the edge of the pond, it was found you literally could create enough weight on the edge of the ice that you could tip the whole surface of the pond. It would sink the ice and raise it on the opposite side. So you definitely don't want to get into that. But after you clear the snow off, you would then grave the surface or mark out the surface. And that's what these period illustrations are showing, different types of tools used for plowing out the grid pattern. Now, on the lower illustration, the cutting edge of the plow is the closest to you. And on the far side, towards that other horse that's coming by in the middle of the image, you'll see another long piece of what is metal. That's actually an outrigger. That's a metal guide, and that will allow you to cut all your blocks the same size. After you cut your first line, you drop that guide into the first line, and all the other lines are taken off that first one. And what you are doing is you are graphing this out to be 22 by 22 inches square. That is the standard in the ice industry, 22 by 22 or 44 by 22, usually 22 by 22. I have been doing this, as I said, for decades. I've been doing all kinds of research and original business records and all kinds of things. I do not know why they decided on 22 by 22. I mean, why the heck just not do it 24 by 24, and make it, I don't know. All of the tools are set up, all your swing arms on your plows, the doors of the ice, they're all built to match the 22 by 22 standard. So it's not the, which came first, the chicken or the egg. The ice blocks came first and everything else was built around that. Who knows if it's weight, who knows? Ice is 56 pounds a cubic foot at its density. So, what that extra 2 inches either way would make is pretty marginal. But anyway, the industry standard, the standard in the business was 22 by 22. And here I am actually laying out the surface of a pond with, instead of a horse-drawn plow, this is a hand plow. And the hand plow was used by most farmers and small businessmen. If you didn't have a large enough operation, you are not going to buy a plow that's going to cost you $24. That's going to cost you like a month's wage for a common laborer to have a horse-drawn plow. Plus, then you have to hire the teamster at $3.50 a day and all that kind of thing. So anyway, the hand plow here, like I'm using, was common as well. You have to be a little more careful or a little more skilled to use the hand plow because you don't have that outrigger or swing arm to be able to help guide you with your lines. After you have the plowing done, the plow is another thing that people do not understand. The plow does not go all the way into the ice. You are looking at cutting ice in an ideal situation that is a foot thick. So at the most, your plows are going to go in 5 or 6 inches. Now that's not nothing. That's good, but you still have to go back and you have to saw, and you saw along those lines that were created by the plows. And that brings us to the lowest man on a totem pole. That is the sawyer. The sawyers were hired, and this price, the monies that I'll be giving you stays true, a little bit up and down with some of the economic panics, but it stays true right up till around World War I or so. You would be paid $1 a day and a meal at the end of the day as a sawyer. And you work usually about a 10-hour day. If you had a full moon, they might get a few more hours out of you, but it's a long day of work out there. But at that time of year, it's about the only thing that's paying cash money. So if you worked as a textile mill laborer and your water wheel froze up in the wintertime and you were out of work, or you were on railroad construction, which didn't go on in the wintertime during that period, you still had to pay your rent. You still had to buy food for your family. This was something that was attractive to go out and get a job on an ice crew. And again, something I shared before the program started, my grandfather up in the Keene, New Hampshire area actually lied about his age so he could get a job on an ice crew because it was a money paying operation in the wintertime when there's so little else to do. So the sawyers cut along the lines. You can see there is some open water where the first channel has been taken out, and everything works away from the open water. People get very worried. Oh, you're working around the open water. You know, people are falling in. You're not working along the edge. You work away from the edge. So you never want to be a bottom man on an ice saw crew. So here's that same illustration, but just kind of flipped around. So the two guys are working opposite each other. And that might look kind of stupid, but that's one of the oldest jokes in the ice crew we know. I've seen it told all the way back to the 1820s. As a matter of fact, Thoreau writes, these ice cutters are a merry race, full of jest and sport. And when I went among them, they were wont to invite me to saw pit fashion with them, standing underneath. And again, as I said, I've seen that story written about many, many times in New York State and out in Michigan and so forth. And the new guy on the crew, you know, is told by the foreman that they're going to be the pitman on the saw. And I could just imagine that young guy standing there and looking at the saw and looking at the foreman and looking at the pond and trying to decide whether or not he was going to say anything or not and lose his job. But it is something that's a kind of part of the trade, the sport in the trade. Now, eventually, by the 19 teens and 1920s, you do find things being mechanized. Now, I'll note it was attempted to be mechanized in the 19th century through steam engines and so forth. It's really a dangerous and sketchy proposition to get steam engines out on ice ponds. So they tried running long leather belts out with idler pulleys and everything. It was just too much technology for the amount of value. But by the beginning of the 20th century, you do find some mechanized operations, but it was really too much too late. The profit wasn't there anymore. We'll get into this a little later by the time you get to that period in the ice business. So after you have those parallel lines cut, you have a row of guys, as you can see on the left here, that will walk along with what are called breaker bars. And the breaker bars are used to snap the final side of your block away from the field device and let it go free into open water. So on the right, you see my partner, Rick Martin, who comes out and works with me and myself, cutting some ice down in Connecticut. And he is using a 2-tined Lynn breaker bar. The Lynn breaker bar is named after the city of Lynn, Lynn, Massachusetts, where it was developed. And a breaker bar is basically a long nosed axe with a handle turned at right angles. And ice grows from the surface downward. The crystals grow from the surface downward. So as you strike on the top surface, you open up the crystals and that will separate the block. So it's like splitting a piece of kindling, like splitting a piece of pine. That grain will snap away. And as long as you have ice that's grown under good conditions, it'll split properly. And this is something you read about as well in the 19th century of the guys that are managing the ice ponds and keeping it clean and getting really irate on kids that are out there ice skating, because ice skating will actually make a false start in your cut and will cause the blocks not to break square. So it's something they would get upset about. And I've noticed a leaf or a rock or a piece of stick gets in there and the grain will grow like a knot in a tree around the leaf or the little pebble, and you don't get a nice square cut. And if you don't get the square cut, then you can't pack the blocks properly. You don't pack them properly, they don't last. So that's something the ice cutters have to worry about. Now, once the block is separated, it has to be removed from the pond. And there's several ways of doing that. But once it's separated, you add the next level of man. Now, as I talk about each one of these people, each one of them is earning more money above what the sawyers were. So the breaker bar guys are earning more money than the sawyers. And the next level about that, above the breaker bars, are the pikemen, the people that work with the ice pikes. And the ice pikes move the blocks either in the water or from the surface over to their next location, either to go up a ramp or to be pulled out, whatever way, and to be able to pass the blocks efficiently from one to the other. Because this is really a division of labor. This is in effect, a mobile factory that you're bringing out to do your harvesting. The ice pikes were designed based on the pikes that are used for raising house frames and barn frames. But again, this is a Nathaniel Wyeth invention. They're made with removable blades, and one side is a pushing side and one side is a pulling side. So if you look at the picture on the left, the pulling side is on your left. If you look at the one on the right, the pulling side is on the right. And just the opposite for the pushing side. God bless you if you try to use the wrong side to move the block in the wrong direction. They also, for those of you that are military people, if you look at the shape of the blade, they look exactly like a Brown Bess or a 1858 Civil War musket bayonet. They're shaped three-sided exactly like a bayonet, and you sharpen them with a file. And you have to keep them sharp. But as you sharpen them and they wear down, you can pop them out of this ring and the one rivet below that holds them on, and you can replace them with new blades. So you don't have to replace the whole tool. And they come in all different lengths from 4 foot to 18 feet long. So once it gets to the edge, you have to pull it out. And as Thoreau wrote, to hook up the virgin mold itself with a peculiar jerk. And it's referred to as the ice cutter's jerk. And I was just explaining this to my physical therapist, where I'm being treated for sciatica because probably I've done too much of this stuff. But anyway, you actually exert very little physical strength. What you do is you grab the block with a set of pond, P-O-N-D, pond tongs, and you push the block underwater as far as you can comfortably do that. And since ice is buoyant, it will rise up, and you use the inertia of its buoyancy as it clears the water to let go of the pond tongs with one hand, grab or keep hold of the handle with your opposite hand and pop the block out. It actually does take very little effort. And here Thoreau calls it the peculiar jerk. In the industry, it's called the ice cutter's jerk, where you snap it onto the surface and then it would be passed on to pikemen, again, to move it along. Just showing some sizes here. I mentioned the standard in the industry is 22 by 22. You can search for this today. It's available online. But a number of years ago, well, it's 2008, I worked with BBC4, and we did part of an episode of the series on Nova about the quest for absolute zero. And it was about Frederick Tudor and his ice industry. And we did an ice harvest for the BBC, where we had oxen and everything else. We did an example of how cutting was done. I wanted to show the picture because it shows these guys holding the basic tools. I've got the plow. The man in the brown coat's got the breaker bar. Mike there in the blue has got the saw, and Rick has got the pike. So some of the basic tools besides the tongs that you need to get this work done. They told me that in a good day they could get out 1,000 tons, which was the yield of about 1 acre. And I have seen that over and over again, that most crews could do about 1 acre a day. And that's a lot of tonnage of ice. Again, we're not talking about pounds, we're talking about tons of ice. In some areas, they did have ice houses. And one of the other industries that developed through the ice trade was the ice elevator. The elevators would draw the ice up from the pond where they had been pushed by the pikemen by way of a chain. Think of a motorcycle drivetrain with wooden slats every 22 inches, and you slide the block into the space between the two slats, and it gets hauled up to the highest point in your ice house, and you then use gravity to allow it to slide back down onto each what's called floor, and you create a floor with blocks of ice, and you build the ice from the bottom to the top. And obviously when you clear out your house or use the crop, it goes from the top to the bottom. Something else that, excuse me, something else that Frederick Tudor actually developed was the above ground ice house. If you look at Jefferson and Washington and people like that, when they were creating their ice storage areas, they were creating ice cellars. That's what was done in England, where you create like a well, you dig a hole in the ground, you throw some straw in, you pile your ragged, jagged pieces of ice on top of that, and you put a roof over it. And they found at the beginning of the 19th century that you lost about 60% of your crop by doing it that way. Sure, you had ice, but you had to make sure to put enough of it away that you didn't lose 60%. Through his shipping, Frederick Tudor found that he could make a building with multiple walls that had dead airspace in between, stack the ice inside to create that large thermal mass, and in a year's time, he would have a loss of 8%. So the difference between 60% and 8% is certainly going to make or break your business. And that's why you had ice houses with ice that was 5 or 7 years old, because it will last that long. And he started actually prefabbing ice houses in Massachusetts and stacking the frame and the sheathing for the ice houses on the deck of the ships when he would first go somewhere. And then he would unload the ice house, put the ice house together on the wharf, and then fill it up with the blocks of ice that he was bringing there. And here you see some of the elevators and these old images. Now, where was the ice going? Well, a lot of the ice, especially in the area there in the Berkshires, was going down to New York City initially. Let me just get back into business for a second here. So I said that this was created, 40 minutes ago as an international trade. Well, the international trade, once it was proven to have customers, got larger and larger and larger and larger and larger till you get to around the time of the American Civil War. And then when you get to 1867, 68, the industry had shown what a difference it could make in your lifestyles and what foods could be available year round, that all of a sudden you had more ice being used domestically than exporting. So that 1868 breaking point is when you start seeing more ice being used locally. And one of the, for our area, our impact, at least on our area, one of the biggest consumers was New York City. New York City would use, by the 1880s, they were using 3,000 tons a day, 3,000 tons a day. Just about 340,000 tons a year. So the ice would be shipped down through rail and water to New York, especially after the Hudson River failed. The Hudson River became more and more polluted, that the Knickerbocker Ice Company, the largest ice company in the United States, they no longer could take ice from the Hudson, so they sought out farther and farther areas away from there to get them. And because the railroads had been established, and a lot of Massachusetts and Connecticut, and railroad shipping was relatively cheap, they got their ice from the Berkshires, from Pittsfield, Richmond, and down the line. So I've got the picture here on the left, which is in front of a grocery store that's buying ice. And I know that this is natural ice. If you look at the picture in the oval here and the picture on the lower left, which is ice I've got, you see the layers. And I can look at a block of ice like that, and each one of the layers represents a weather incident that happened during that winter. So just as you would look at the rings of a tree and be able to tell what happened from year to year, I can tell what happened over the wintertime by looking at those lines, those layers in that block. So these blocks are natural blocks, and they're not the best. The whiter the color, the more air that's mixed in with the ice, the more air, the less refrigeration quality. So anyway, it's great to see a historic picture where you can see natural ice being delivered to where it's going to be used. if you're looking for local signs of the ice industry, you could do things like, if you're doing research, here's a Richards Atlas for the town in Westfield where I live now. And it shows where the ice house was by the rail yards and the rail lines. In the city of Springfield, Massachusetts, you had a pond that was created by the Springfield Armory to run their machinery to make all their firearms, but they also harvested ice on that pond. They used the ice for tempering steels and so forth. So if you happen to get a contract to cut ice on Watershop's pond, part of the fee that you paid for the rights to do that was in tonnage of ice. You were required to fill the ice houses at the Armory. And from what I found, there was at least 3 of them of varying sizes. You had to fill those first before you could start taking any of it away. Here is examples of ice houses on the ponds in Southwick, Massachusetts, the Congamon. The Congamon itself produced about 250,000 tons a year. So it was a very major source for ice, including New York City. The rail line was put in specifically to bring ice away from the ponds. But here you have from the 1926 city directory from Great Barrington, you've got Howard Root, who's an ice dealer there in town. And here is the 1904 map that shows where his ice house was and where the business was located there in town. Now, not every ice house was huge like those ones around the lake. There were also smaller ones. Eventually, as I said, things turned more to the domestic trade. So you had ice houses like the ones I'm showing you here. The one in the upper left is the one in Hancock Shaker Village, which was built in the 1890s. And that replaced 3 other smaller ice houses that they owned. This ice house was designed to hold 200 tons of ice. And for a number of years, for a decade or more, I cut ice here at Hancock Shaker Village, and we would store some of it away in that ice house. The other one, the gray one here, is at the Wayside Inn in Sudbury, Massachusetts. And this one was built by Henry Ford when he when he took over the Wayside Inn. And this was in the 1920s. And right next to the this particular building, which now is used for storing lawnmowers and so forth, is the remains of the ice pond. It's now a duck and goose pond for people to come and throw bread in and feed it. But anyway, he did want to have an ice house to be able to provide ice to the working hotel, quote unquote, tavern that he was running. This is a model of an ice house that comes out of a government publication that shows what a local farmer can do. After the American Civil War, many farmers started specializing in their farming, and you start seeing more and more things like dairy farms here in New England. And if you're going to be successful in a dairy farm, you needed to be able to cool the milk down quickly during milking season to separate the cream. So it was suggested that you put between 1 and 1.5 tons of ice a year away for every 1 head of cattle that you were milking. So most farmers would have an ice house that would be 15 by 17 by 2 stories high. You'd be putting away enough tonnage to take care of the farm's use. An interior view here that shows the milk room, which is cold. It's cool because cold air drops, displaces the warm air, vice versa. Warm air drops, displaces cold air. Anyway, you've got the cold that will be onto the whether it's milk or fruits or vegetables when it comes to Hancock. Something that you have to have that you don't, at least I didn't initially think about, is you have to have ventilation in your ice house, because every time you open the door in the summertime to take ice out, you let warm air in. So you take advantage of that warm air rising and you put a vent to the top. So even in places like Connecticut, where I have the statistics, it can be 96 degrees on the outside. And when you open the door to the ice house, immediately inside, it'll be 46 degrees. And of course, in the center of your sack, it's still 32 because you've got such a large thermal mass. A lot of it ended up by railway going out to other places in the country, like out to the Midwest, the West, and the far West, even as far as California, New England ice would go. And one of the places it went to was Chicago. And all those John Wayne movies where you're getting the cattle up to the railhead because you got to get Kansas and go down to, well, all those cowboys existed because Chicago existed, so that the cattle could be butchered there. And they could be butchered on such a large scale because you had the ice to pack them in and then distributed them from there. So the two largest ice houses that ever existed in the United States, one was for Swift Premium, which is still in business today. You get your Swift Premium bacon. And the other one was Pabst Blue Ribbon, Pabst Brewing Company. And the Pabst Brewing Company ice house was so large, it covered so many acres, that they actually would bring in a steam engine hauling freight cars into the ice house. And as the box cars were being filled with lager beer. Lager beer must be cold. It must have ice to be brewed. As it was being filled and the steam engine idled, the steam that came off would turn into snow in August and snow inside of the ice house. That's how massive of a mini environment it was. Pretty amazing stuff. Also, a big change took effect in the fishing industry. For hundreds and hundreds of years, you had fishermen would go out and they catch cod. They would salt it down. People ate salt cod for hundreds of years. And then the ice industry comes along and all of a sudden you start crushing ice. You can pack your cod and your other fish in ice and you can sell it for fresh year round instead of salted, and make much larger quantity. So you start finding people giving up other types of trade and going in only to the ice fishing business, as I said, like in Gloucester and other ports like that. Sometimes one of the great cakes slips from the iceman's sled into the village street and lies there for a week. Yes, it really did, like a great emerald, an object of interest to all passers. So, as I said, you get more and more demand from the domestic trade. People are being sold to have refrigerators in their house. And yes, it was called a refrigerator. The term refrigerator was actually patented in 1803. It has nothing to do with electricity or compressors. It has to do with cooling things. But they were called refrigerators. Anyway, more and more people were having refrigerators in their houses. So you start seeing the whole industry of delivering ice to houses and to businesses. And in a city directory from Great Barrington in 1894, you find William Pixley on East Main and Elmwood Avenue, who's a farmer and an ice dealer. And in 1926, you find Lincoln Smith on North Egremont Road, who's an ice dealer, and Frederick Couch, who is an ice peddler, or guy going around with one of those wagons. Well, why are we not doing this all today? Well, I kind of hinted at it when I was talking about the Hudson River. What happens is things become more and more polluted. People start to be very concerned about the quality of their ice. You've got the end of the ice age, the little ice age. So you don't have the natural ice being formed as regularly as you did have. So you start having ice famine years, 1890, 1895, 1918. Those were all ice famine years, years in which the ice crop failed. So a little company called General Electric developed compressors that could run on these new rural electrification power, and you were able to start having man-made ice. And all the way back into the 1880s and 1890s, you find people filtering natural water through charcoal and sand to purify it. Some people are using, like down in Hartford, West Hartford, they're using deep wells to bring water up and then using compressed gas to cool salt water. And then you immerse containers, metal containers of fresh water in that super cooled salt water, and you create man-made ice. It's like how the old-fashioned crank ice cream maker would work. That's how ice was made by man. And man-made ice continued to be delivered to people's homes, depending on the area you're in, right through the 1940s and 1950s. But for the majority of people between the First and Second World War is really where you have the end of the natural ice trade and the beginning of the compressed gas business. Just as an aside, compressed gas refrigeration had been known since the 1500s. It was just ridiculously expensive, and the equipment was crazy to try to run, and very, very dangerous up until the 20th century. The first large-scale compressed gas refrigeration you see in this country is actually during the American Civil War, where a tobacco warehouse in Richmond is turned into a refrigeration plant using a surplus railroad steam engine to compress the ammonia gas to do the refrigeration. Anyway, with the pure food and the technology changing and the weather changing, that's the death knell of the natural ice trade business. And if you want to learn more about this, I would strongly recommend getting a copy of Northeast Historic Films, Harvesting Ice in New England from 1926 to 1957. It's like $14.99 or $15 from them. It just so happens I narrate it. I kind of explain what's going on in the film. This is a collection of silent films. All except the last one is in black and white. The one from 1957 is in color. But they're silent films for the most part, as you can imagine, from that period. So I kind of explain what's going on in them. And also, I get my yearly royalty check from any of these sales. So I want to buy a cup of coffee this year from the royalty. I really don't get that much. Also, I have copies of Harvesting and Storing Ice on the Farm. It's a reprint of very faithful reprint of a original government document from about 100 years ago. And it has a very brief introduction that I wrote to the ice trade. So those are two resources you can use. Now, the two best resources that I didn't have anything to do with to any degree is a book called The Frozen Water Trade, and the other one is called America's Icemen, both of which are out of print. So you can search around for them, but they're probably the two best if you want to read about them. So I thank you all for listening tonight. We'll see if I can stop sharing here, and we can see if anybody's still out there about answering any questions that people might have. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dennis.
Any questions? You have to unmute yourself, or somebody has to unmute you.
Can you describe a little bit more how the initial ice is cut?
You basically just chop a hole with an axe or a breaker bar big enough to get the tip of your saw in. You drop your saw in and you go from there.
But that initial sled that you drag, how did that cut?
If you're familiar with woodworking tools, there's a woodworking plane that cuts the groove in the side of a chest of drawers drawer so that you can slide the bottom into. The blade is exactly like that. He was basing it on a woodworking plane. So you have, on most of them, you have a series of 8 of those blades that go around. One is slightly deeper than the one before it, and that will cut your groove or grave the surface of the pond that you're working on.
Oh, I see. Thank you.
Sure. They actually run pretty easy. There's enough, like a lot of tools, there's enough weight behind it that whether it's being pulled or pushed by a person or dragged by an animal, it's much, in my opinion, it's much easier to plow a straight line in ice than it is to plow a furrow if you're planting corn with a horse. Much easier. I think because you have much more of a grade than you do in soil than you do in earth.
Huh. Okay.
Anyone else?
Was straw or hay or anything used between the layers of the ice as they were packed in the ice house?
No.
They just were on top of each other?
No. You want it to refreeze up against itself so it creates a thermal mass. You put anything in between the layers, what ends up happening is that allows water and air to get in and it makes everything melt. People have this misconception about the use of hay and straw because you didn't use hay, you use straw because straw is hollow. So it's an insulator. You've got a body with air in between, so it makes an insulation. So when you get to the top of your ice house, if you haven't filled it all the way up, you've got space up there. You put straw or sawdust, depending where you are. In Maine, they use sawdust because of the logging industry, and the logging industry would actually pay you to take the sawdust away. It's something you needed, so you got paid to get something you wanted. But anyway, in this area down in Connecticut, they use mostly straw because it was waste from farms, the grain growing. So they would stack straw on top of the last layer. They put a tarpaulin over that. And as they unloaded the ice house, as I said, you unload it from the top down because you don't want to go on hundreds of tons of ice and try to pull the bottom one out. So you go from the top down. And what happens when you pull the first block out, the straw filters down to the next layer, and so forth as you go through. So when people would see blocks of ice coming out, they would have random pieces of straw stuck to the top of them. So they assumed ice was in each layer. And it's actually something that's talked about in the industry at the time. Whatever you do, if you have an odd shaped block, get rid of it. If you've got anything that's causing those blocks not to touch each other, get rid of it because you want them to be tightly packed together.
If the blocks are all frozen together, how do you get them apart?
You actually have to use very similar tools to what you use when you first harvest them. You actually have to use breaker bars and so forth. But the problem is in an ice house, you don't have water underneath. You've got another solid layer. So instead of straight handle tools, you have basically a S-curve handle tool for getting down inside and moving up. Instead of a straight bladed saw, you have what's called a crescent saw. It's like a demi-lune saw, and you rock it back and forth instead of up and down, and that'll cut down through you. Those crescent saws are as rare as hen's teeth. It's one of the few tools that I don't own that I'd like to find someday.
I think one of the other uses from my childhood in the 60s of hanging around the roundhouse before you got to the, well, Perlman's junkyard is now, used to be a railroad roundhouse. And in the building, they had a small wooden building inside of that, which had blocks of ice. And it was my impression that they took a block of ice and they put it in a passenger car, a railroad car, in the water dispenser, and then the ice would just melt down, and that was where they got the water from.
Well, the first reefers or refrigerator cars were actually patented in the 1870s, but in the 1830s, they were already icing cars, and the railroad used thousands and thousands of tons of ice a year. That's what most of the New England ice going to California was doing, is it was icing down rail cars to bring back fruit and lettuce and things like that back from the West Coast. So they had icing stations throughout the Midwest that were filled up with ice from New England. And after a train would go so many hundreds of miles, the ice would all be melted in these refrigerator cars, and they would refill the bunkers, is what they're called in the car. But in the 1830s, what they would do is if your railroad is running in this direction, they would put piles of ice in a freight car on the front of the car, put their fruits and seafood, especially seafood, in the car behind it. As the train moved along, the air is forced over the ice and then over your cargo. So they were doing refrigerating cars before technically there were reefer cars. And that's how they were able to ship oysters and clams and so forth from the Delaware, Maryland area out to St. Louis in 2 days. And you were perfectly fresh to eat by the 1850s.
Question about the ice houses. They don't seem to have enough doors.
You don't have a lot of doors.
You'd have to put the ice in at the top and
No,
drop
well, the doors go all the way to the bottom. So you start loading from the bottom and then close the door up when you get that height. And then you open the next door. So you go up.
Okay, the one in Hancock Shaker Village doesn't seem to have enough doors.
It does. I didn't show you the picture of the ice bunker side. The loading of the ice bunker side is on the side that faces the blacksmith shop. And there you have the doors at.
Okay.
The side that I'm showing you is the side for the food storage area. It's built on the side of a hill.
A friend of ours who's an author, and he wrote about his grandfather coming over from Italy to this country, to New York City by himself. And one of the first jobs he had was helping to deliver ice. And within the story, he tells how the man he worked for would tell him to get that ice up there quickly before it melted, and they didn't get what they were paying for. Yeah, so it's quite good. Clark and Anita, you know, Chris's
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, the other thing is, since you're selling it by weight, yeah, it is important. Behind me here on the wall, I actually have some ice scales. You had to sell it by weight, and the one that ice scale that I bring around when I do demos or I do talks, like if this was live, I'd have all these tools for you to see, is one of them that I bring around is sealed. And we know about sealers of weights and measures because when you go to the gas station, you see the paper seal on the pump. Well, sealers would also examine the scales that ice dealers had because you could tinker with them and not get honest weights. And this one has the lead seal on the back where the examiner looked at it. He then poured the lead and stamped it. And it's actually from a New York City delivery wagon. What most people also don't know is the ice men that delivered, they would pay for their ice at the ice house. They weren't given the ice. They paid for it. And any chipping or anything, that literally, if you talk about chipping, that cut into their profits. Or melting.
Yeah.
So all those little kids, stealing the little ice chips off the back of your wagon, it wasn't that they were just being cranky to be cranky, but that was part of their profit.
Yeah, Crescent Creamery used to deliver the milk to our house in the 50s and 60s in those Divco trucks. You're familiar, all us old guys. And they'd always leave a puddle of water because they had blocks of ice in the back of the truck. They weren't refrigerated, just a block of ice or more.
Yeah, there was a nice down in Sheffield. I used to be director of the Sheffield Historical Society. Down in Sheffield, there's some great images of the co-op creamery that was down there. And they had their own ice pond in their ice house down there as well. Well, I think we're drawing nigh on time here. I appreciate everybody listening today, everybody that attended, and come on back and listen to some more folklore about about New England history, especially with a little talk that we're having on the whole maple sugar business. So,
This has been
thank you,
great.
everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to Great Barrington. I happened to notice the clipping in the Eagle, so I got signed up for this. But I go to your website and sign up for email notices. I suspect you send out notices for all these events from the library.
We send out a monthly email saying everything that's coming up, and then we send out reminders. So, if you see something at the beginning of the month that you think you might be interested in, and then you forget about it at the end of the month, we'll send a reminder.
How can we get on the Great Barrington list? I'm in Dalton.
Just go to the library webpage, which is gblibraries.org. And we just recently changed it, so I can't tell exactly where it is, but there's a join our mailing list link.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where can we get the books that Dennis was talking about?
You can email me and I will do my best to hunt them down for you if you'd like. My email is tleodari. Yeah, I know
You spell it just like it sounds.
Yeah, you spell it just like it sounds, and I am on the website.
Oh, okay.
So if you go to the website and go to staff, I'm the assistant director for programming. So my email's there.
Yeah. It brings back my childhood because when I was small, my whole family would go up to Ontario to a little cottage on a lake every summer, and no electricity or running water or anything. And in fact, we couldn't get to the cottage by car. And so my father and older brother would take a rowboat down to the little village and get a big chunk of ice with the tongs and put it in the rowboat and bring it back and put it in our icebox.
Oh, wow. Cool. Neat. Well, I think all the libraries within the county and throughout are to be applauded and congratulated for doing all of these Zoom meetings for us during this pandemic. It's kind of like it brings the light and I guess expands our knowledge of things that we maybe normally wouldn't do or be interested in. But I think, having all of this has really been, it kind of helps to move the time along you know, till such day when we could actually come and see Dennis in person or, you know, another speaker. So to Great Barrington Library, I thank you very much.
And get on Stockbridge Library's list.
Yes,
too,
I
'cause
am
they
on
have a lot of good stuff.
They have some good things too, yes. And the Mount also does a lot of good Zoom meetings with different authors and Mass Audubon. So there's been a good cross section of things. you
Don't
know.
forget Ollie.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Now, how about Dalton? Not to cut into this conversation, but
I
does
haven't
Dalton?
had much. There really hasn't been anything.
Okay, all right, very good.
We have out in my area, out here in the Pioneer Valley, we have a cooperative library group of the smaller libraries. They call themselves the Library in the Woods. And they're all these, you know, very small town libraries. And that's something, again, just go online and search out for them. They just did a cooperative program last night amongst them on finding easy walks for seniors or people with challenges. Again, something that, you know, because they're cooperative, it went much beyond just what their local audience would have been.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Where are you based, Dennis?
I'm in Westfield right now, Westfield, Massachusetts.
Okay. So have you harvested ice in many different places?
Anywhere from Enfield, Connecticut to Enfield, New Hampshire, and from Hudson, New York to Hudson, Massachusetts.
Are you the one that does the occasional demos out at Hancock?
Yes, yeah. We used to, for over 10 years, we used to cut every year up on their reservoir, which is where the shakers cut.
You're not doing that anymore?
We're not the, well, essentially with COVID and stuff going on, the last 2 winters, we've done a winter program, but it's not something that's going to happen this year.
No.
You know, back to ice harvesting, I got the impression sometimes they would open up a channel of water and then float the ice to the shore.
Yeah, that first open water that I showed in the original illustration, that's your channel or canal, and everything goes into that. But of course, that becomes wider and wider as you move along.
And one of the pictures that you showed almost looked as though they had a lot of open water, but then they left walkways of ice to get around various open areas.
Right, yes.
Yeah, you don't want to paint yourself into a corner, so to speak.
No. No. Well, you also can create, what they did is they created floats where it's several blocks. They didn't break off every block. They would break off every 15 blocks, and we create a float that you could stand on, and basically like a flatboat, you can move it around a pond or whatever. But a lot of ponds were not that large. You know, if you look around New England, there aren't that many ponds that are more than 2-3 acres at the most.
They didn't harvest Onoda Lake or Pontusic Lake.
Oh, they sure did. There wasn't one body of water in New England. When you could make, okay, let's put it this way. Are we running way too long here, Talia?
No,
It would
you're good.
It would cost me, in the 19th century, it cost me as an ice dealer between $1.50 and $1.60 to put away a ton of ice for a year. That's paying all my labor and all my housing charges. I make, when I sell a 100-pound block of ice, I get 85 cents. Now it costs me $1.60 for a ton. What kind of profit am I making? You cut everywhere. And the railroad pay for it. The railroad kept going up and up on their charges too, for what they were charging to ship it, because they knew there was a profit. And then you had places originally like Massachusetts that decided that they needed to get in on this deal because nobody was taxing the business. So they figured out how to tax it. And most of the tax laws that were written in Massachusetts were adopted by other states as they got into the ice industry. And not only did Massachusetts tax the ice once, they figured out how to tax it twice. Because if you owned an ice pond, you were charged a real estate value for the pond, because it had, just like if you have undeveloped land or developed land, if you have an ice pond, it's more valuable than a pond that you're just using to irrigate your farm. So you tax it as real estate. But the minute you cut the block of ice and it clears the water, when it gets into the air, it's a commodity and it's taxed by the state as a commodity. So you're charged twice for the same thing. It was riparian law. It was tacked on to the old English riparian or water rights laws. But yeah, Massachusetts did it first, and then all the other states joined in.
I'm not quite clear on how they manufactured ice in bulk when the natural ice became too polluted.
Well, you've used one of the old-fashioned ice cream makers, right?
Yeah.
where you crank, you've got ice and salt on the outside, that's creating salt water, which has a lower freezing temperature. It's 28 degrees instead of 32 degrees.
Okay.
So when you put your cream in the center and you start cracking it so it has contact with the metal of that case, it's lowering the temperature of what's inside and causing it to freeze. So substitute pure water in that canister instead of cream, and that's how they create it. It's how it's done today, except they're not using ammonia. They're not using the dangerous gases that they used originally.
That advertisement though, was it advertising it as though it was cheaper? That sounds like it would be more expensive.
Yeah.
It was initially, but as you got more and more challenges in the natural trade,
Mm.
it became cheaper to freeze, and the quality was constant, was always the same. All right, I gotta go, folks. I actually got another talk tomorrow that I have to get all my stuff together for, but I do appreciate you coming, and I certainly appreciate the questions. So thanks,
Thank you very
everybody.
much.
Thank
We'll
you so
see ya.
much, Dennis.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So this will be recorded and on the library website?
Yes, it has been recorded. And I sent a chat. I don't know if you can see the chat. I sent a chat to everybody that has my email address in it. And you can email me if you're looking for it. It will take us a little while to get it up because out of a staff of 13, there are only 6 of us
Yeah, sure.
who are still working. So it takes us a while to get to things, but it really will be available.
Good.
Yeah, somebody mentioned in Pittsfield what they just use Onoda Lake or Pontusic, but they also used Morewood Lake behind the country club. And that was, the production there was sufficient enough to put in a railroad siding for the ice production. And it also had a building that blew up at some point, which I'm not, I don't have it on the top of my head, all the details, but people were injured and killed. And Goodrich Pond in the Lakewood section, that was an ice pond, and Richmond Pond, of course, that had a railroad siding also. So it was big business when you get a railroad siding to hook up.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Well,
Bye,
thank you
Clark.
all very
Bye.
much.
Bye-bye. Bye, Anita.
Hey, Marie, Anita,
Bye. Okay.
Carol, hey, Carol and Owen.
All right.
They're up in Vermont waiting to get their CV shots up there.
Oh,